The first thing I noticed when I opened my eyes was the ceiling fan, its blades wobbling in a slow, uneven circle above the narrow bed, stirring the humid air of the dormitory just enough to keep the smell of detergent and sweat from settling too heavily. And for several long seconds I lay there staring at it, listening to the distant clang of the morning assembly bell, trying to decide whether the ache in my chest belonged to memory or to the present moment. In my last life, the morning of my disgrace had begun exactly like this: thick summer air, the fan rattling as though it might detach from the ceiling, the sense that something intangible was shifting beneath the surface of routine, and yet I had walked into that day with complete trust in the man who would dismantle me before sunset. I had believed in Daniel Harper with a certainty so naive it almost embarrassed me now. I had believed that the careful way he folded his uniform, the measured tone he used when speaking to superiors, the restrained smile he offered me in private all signified integrity. I had mistaken composure for character. And when the accusation came: embezzlement, falsified reports, undermining collective funds for personal gain, I had laughed at first, certain it was a misunderstanding that Daniel would correct with a single sentence. Instead, he had stood before the investigative committee with his hands clasped behind his back and said, with heartbreaking calm, that he had trusted me completely and was deeply disappointed to discover irregularities tied to my name. The words were precise, careful, devastating. In that moment, the room had turned colder than winter. The version of me who lived that first life had not fought back effectively. I had stammered, pleaded, tried to explain that the financial discrepancies were impossible because I had triple-checked every ledger, because I never signed off without verifying each entry, because integrity was the only thing I truly owned. But emotion is not evidence, and evidence, as I later learned, can be manufactured. Daniel had positioned himself masterfully. He expressed sorrow rather than anger, regret rather than outrage, and in doing so, he made himself appear like the victim of betrayal rather than the architect of it. Behind him stood Claire Whitman, newly transferred from the Provincial Bureau, her posture demure but her eyes sharp as polished glass. I had once considered her a friend, had shared tea with her in the evenings, had listened to her complain about the monotony of paperwork. I had not seen how carefully she observed the hierarchy, how deliberately she aligned herself with rising stars. By the time the investigation concluded, the missing funds were traced to authorizations under my identification code codes that, I would later realize too late, Daniel had access to whenever I left my desk unattended. I was dismissed quietly, my name removed from the roster with bureaucratic efficiency, and Daniel's promotion proceeded with only minor delay. Claire became his wife within the year. I left the compound carrying a single suitcase and a reputation that felt heavier than stone. My death in that life was not dramatic. It was gradual, eroding rather than explosive. I relocated to a coastal factory town, took work in an assembly line position that required no references beyond willingness to endure long hours. The rhythm of the machines dulled my thoughts at first, then sharpened them into something unbearable. I replayed every conversation with Daniel, every look exchanged with Claire, every moment I could have acted differently. I wondered whether love had blinded me or whether I had willingly closed my eyes, because the truth would have required courage I did not yet possess. When the factory downsized during an economic adjustment, I found myself jobless again, savings thin, prospects thinner. The night I collapsed from exhaustion in the boarding house hallway, fever burning through my body untreated because I had delayed seeing a doctor to save money, I understood with a strange clarity that my greatest failure had not been trusting the wrong man but failing to trust myself. I died not from betrayal alone but from the slow internalization of shame I had never earned. So when I awoke once more in the dormitory of the administrative compound, the calendar on the wall displaying the year 1984 in bold black print, I did not cry out in confusion. I inhaled deeply, testing the air as though it might dissolve if I moved too quickly, and felt something steady settle inside me. This was not a gift to relive love. It was an opportunity to correct weakness. I rose before the assembly bell and sat at my desk reviewing the financial ledgers that would, in a few months, become the weapon used against me. The discrepancies were not yet present. The books were clean, orderly, balanced. But I knew how easily numbers could be manipulated if one controlled both authorization and narrative. This time, I began documenting not only transactions but access patterns. Who entered the office after hours, who requested keys, who lingered near my desk under pretext. I changed my identification code quietly and memorized it rather than writing it down. I made duplicates of every signed authorization and stored them in a sealed envelope addressed to myself, postmarked and left unopened in my personal trunk, a timestamp no one could dispute. Daniel noticed the change in me almost immediately. He had been accustomed to my ready smiles, my eagerness to assist with his reports, my unspoken pride in his ambition. Now I responded with professional politeness but no warmth. When he invited me for evening walks around the compound lake, I declined under the excuse of additional auditing tasks. When he teased that I was becoming too serious, I met his gaze and asked whether seriousness was not a virtue in our line of work. There was a flicker in his expression, then brief, calculating as though he were reassessing variables. Claire, too, adjusted her approach. She began stopping by my desk more frequently, asking seemingly innocuous questions about budget allocations, expressing admiration for my meticulous record-keeping. In my previous life, I had been flattered. Now I was cautious. I answered only what was necessary, never revealing the full structure of my tracking system. I watched them the way a patient observer watches a storm forming on the horizon, not with panic but with preparation. The accusation came 3 months earlier than before, perhaps because my subtle distance unsettled Daniel's timing. It unfolded during a departmental review meeting, the air thick with summer heat and anticipation. Claire presented a summary of quarterly expenditures and paused at a highlighted section, her voice carefully modulated as she pointed out irregular transfers to a miscellaneous expenses account authorized under my code. A murmur rippled through the room. Daniel leaned forward, brow furrowed in what appeared to be concern, and asked whether there might have been a clerical oversight. The director turned to me for explanation. In my last life, my pulse had roared in my ears. This time, it slowed. I requested permission to access my files and produced not only the duplicate authorizations, but also the envelope postmarked months prior, which I opened in full view of the committee to reveal copies identical to the originals, all devoid of the suspicious transfers Claire had just displayed. The contrast was immediate and undeniable. If the official ledger showed altered entries, then the tampering had occurred after my records were sealed. The room shifted palpably. Suspicion, once aimed squarely at me, redirected like a beam of light turned by a mirror. I did not accuse Daniel directly. I merely explained the chain of custody for the ledgers, noting that access logs indicated multiple late-night entries by senior staff entries recorded by the security desk. I presented the logbook copies I had obtained weeks prior under the pretext of updating archival procedures. Claire's composure fractured first. Her cheeks flushed, her fingers tightened around the stack of papers she held. Daniel attempted to regain control by suggesting an internal review rather than a formal investigation, but the director, now visibly wary, insisted on external auditors. Facts, once introduced, have a momentum of their own. The audit took weeks. During that time, Daniel avoided me entirely, and Claire oscillated between brittle politeness and sharp hostility. I continued my duties as though nothing had changed, arriving punctually, leaving precisely on schedule, refusing to indulge gossip. When the results were finally announced, they were thorough and unambiguous. The altered entries had been inserted through an override code accessible only to senior administrative officers. Daniel's credentials matched the timestamps. Claire's involvement surfaced through correspondence linking her to unauthorized procurement requests tied to the siphoned funds. The revelation did not produce dramatic confessions. Instead, it yielded a quiet unraveling. Daniel's promotion was rescinded. Disciplinary measures included demotion and reassignment to a distant rural bureau. Claire resigned before formal charges could escalate, citing personal reasons, though the subtext was clear to everyone present. When Daniel approached me privately one last time, his expression no longer composed but strained. He attempted to frame his actions as desperation pressure to excel. Expectations from family, the belief that minor adjustments would go unnoticed. He spoke of ambition as though it were a force beyond his control, something that had carried him too far. I listened without interruption, noting how he still avoided a direct apology. When he finished, I told him calmly that ambition without integrity is merely greed in a tailored uniform, and that I wished him clarity in his new post. There was no anger in my tone, only finality. The power dynamic had shifted not because he had fallen, but because I no longer needed his validation to stand upright. Unlike my previous life, I did not remain in the compound after the scandal resolved. Vindication restored my reputation, but it did not erase the suffocating atmosphere of institutional politics. The reform era was opening doors beyond government offices. Private enterprises were sprouting in cities once defined solely by state planning. I had always possessed a quiet fascination with food preservation, having grown up watching my grandmother pickle vegetables and ferment sauces with instinctive precision. What if tradition could meet market demand? The idea seemed both practical and daring. So I submitted my resignation, citing a desire to pursue independent business. Colleagues expressed surprise. Some warned that stability should not be abandoned lightly. But I understood now that stability anchored to fragile structures is illusion. I relocated to a growing riverside city where new marketplaces buzzed with cautious optimism. Securing a storefront required negotiation, savings, and a willingness to accept risk. I leased a narrow space near the morning market, its walls stained from previous tenants, but its location ideal for foot traffic. I began modestly. Jars of pickled mustard greens, fermented bean paste prepared according to my grandmother's method, chili oil infused with spices sourced from regional suppliers. At first, customers were skeptical of a young woman claiming expertise in traditional preservation. So I offered samples, inviting them to taste before purchasing. I explained the process with transparency, emphasizing cleanliness, timing, balance. Word spread slowly but steadily that there was a stall where flavor carried memory, where a spoonful of sauce could evoke childhood kitchens and family gatherings. I reinvested profits into better equipment, sterilization tools, larger ceramic vats. I kept meticulous records of supply costs and seasonal fluctuations, applying the same financial discipline that had once nearly been weaponized against me. Growth accelerated in the third year when a local restaurant began ordering in bulk, impressed by the consistency of my products. I hired assistants, trained them not only in technique but in respect for process. We expanded into packaged goods with simple labels bearing my name, a reclamation of identity once threatened. Unlike the sterile prestige of administrative offices, this work was tactile, aromatic, alive. My hands carried the scent of garlic and chili rather than ink and paper. There were challenges: spoilage during a particularly humid summer, a supplier who attempted to inflate prices, but each obstacle reinforced rather than eroded my confidence. I negotiated contracts with firmness learned from prior betrayal. I refused credit arrangements that felt unstable. I built resilience into the business the way one builds salt into brine intentionally for preservation. Years later, when I read in a regional bulletin that Daniel had resigned after repeated performance reviews in his rural post, I felt no surge of triumph. Instead, I experienced a quiet recognition of divergence. In another timeline, I had allowed his choices to dictate the trajectory of my life. In this one, his actions became merely a catalyst. The true transformation had occurred within me the moment I chose preparation over blind trust, documentation over emotion, departure over complacency. On the 5th anniversary of my shop's opening, I hosted a small celebration outside the storefront. Lanterns strung overhead, jars arranged like trophies of patience and craft. Customers who had become friends shared stories of meals transformed by my sauces. Children dipped dumplings into chili oil with delighted expressions. My parents, once anxious about my resignation from government service, stood beside me with unmistakable pride. As dusk settled and the river reflected the glow of city lights, I understood that rebirth is not about rewriting others. It is about refining oneself. Daniel and Claire had reacted differently in this life, less overtly malicious, more cornered by their own haste, but their nature had not fundamentally changed. What had changed was my response. I no longer equated love with surrender or authority with safety. I had learned that systems can fail, people can deceive, and reputations can be targeted. But skill combined with foresight creates leverage no rumor can dismantle. Standing before my shop, listening to the hum of evening traffic and the laughter of customers lingering longer than necessary, I felt a completeness that did not depend on apology or revenge. I had preserved more than vegetables and sauces. I had preserved myself.